What I remember very, very vividly was it looked like she kind of just floated across the floor. It was crazy. Still stays with me to this day.
You weren't into her? And here's the question.
No, that's
who's
not
into Nicole Kidman?
That's not true. That's why you gotta have context.
I was like, where was your bar for humanity?
For nearly 2 decades, Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman were considered one of Hollywood's most unshakable couples, the rare pairing of country charm and movie star grace. They smiled through red carpets, shared laughter in interviews, and spoke often about their unbreakable love. But behind those dazzling smiles and tender gestures was a story far more fragile than the public ever knew. Recently, at 57, Keith Urban broke his silence, finally revealing the real reason his once-perfect marriage to Nicole Kidman fell apart. It wasn't scandal, betrayal, or fame that tore them apart, but something much deeper. A battle Keith had been fighting long before he ever met Nicole. For years, fans speculated about the cracks in their fairy tale, the missed public appearances, the quiet separations, and the growing emotional distance between them. But Keith's revelation shocked even those closest to him. What really ended their marriage wasn't anger, but love, and the painful realization that sometimes loving someone means letting them go. In his words, it wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about survival, hers and mine. Today, we look beyond the headlines and discover the truth behind the heartbreak, the sacrifices, the silence, and the emotional battles that led Keith Urban to walk away from the woman he once called his saving grace. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories don't end with forever. They end with goodbye. When Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman first met in 2005, it felt like the universe had written their love story in advance. She was one of Hollywood's most respected actresses, elegant, accomplished, and still healing from her painful split with Tom Cruise. He was the ruggedly handsome Australian country singer whose voice carried both charm and heartbreak. Together, they seemed unstoppable, two souls who found each other at just the right time. Their first meeting took place at the G'day USA Gala in Los Angeles. Nicole later admitted that the moment she saw Keith, something inside her shifted. "I remember thinking, I didn't know who he was, but I felt like I'd known him forever." Keith, on the other hand, said it took him a few months to find the courage to call her. But when he finally did, sparks flew instantly. In June 2006, just a year after they met, they married in a candlelit ceremony in Sydney, surrounded by close friends and family. It was a fairy tale wedding, complete with hymns, tears, and the promise of forever. Fans fell in love with them all over again. Nicole glowed with happiness, and Keith often said, "Meeting her changed everything. She saved me." But behind that romantic statement was a truth that few understood. At the time, Keith was still battling inner demons, addictions that had haunted him for years. Nicole knew about his struggles, but she believed in him completely. She once said, "When I love deeply. I'm not afraid to fight for it." And fight she did. Just 4 months after their wedding, Keith checked himself into rehab. The headlines were brutal, painting the story as the fall of another celebrity marriage. But Nicole didn't run. Instead, she stood by him, flying to visit him during treatment and defending him against public judgment. "He's a man worth fighting for," she told reporters. When Keith emerged from rehab, he credited Nicole for saving his life. "Her love pulled me back from the edge," he said emotionally. "I don't know where I'd be if she hadn't walked into my world." For a while, it seemed they had conquered everything: addiction, fame, and distance. They welcomed 2 daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, and built a quiet life between Nashville and Sydney. Their bond appeared unbreakable. Whether on stage or at award shows, their affection was genuine. Small touches, shared glances, whispered words only they could hear. To outsiders, they were proof that love could heal even the deepest wounds. But behind the cameras, cracks began to form. Keith's demanding tour schedule kept him away for months at a time, while Nicole's acting career continued to soar internationally. The constant distance started to wear them down. They tried to bridge it with phone calls, Private jets and surprise visits, but slowly. Emotional exhaustion began to set in. Nicole, ever the nurturer, often said her dream was to have a simple life, one filled with love, laughter, and family dinners. Keith's dream, however, was the stage, the music that had saved him once but was now consuming him all over again. The love was still there, deep, real, and unshakable, but life was pulling them in two very different directions. And though neither wanted to admit it, they both began to feel the quiet ache of a love slipping away. By 2019, whispers of trouble began surfacing again. Paparazzi photos showed them distant, withdrawn, and visibly strained. Keith brushed off the rumors, but those who knew them best could sense the change. It wasn't anger or betrayal. It was fatigue. Two people who had given everything to each other were simply running out of strength to keep holding on. As the years went on, Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman's seemingly perfect marriage began to face the one thing no love can completely escape: reality. Fame, distance, and pressure had begun weaving invisible threads of tension between them. To the outside world, their life looked like a dream. They lived between a sprawling estate in Nashville and a luxurious home in Sydney, raising two beautiful daughters, Sunday and Faith. They walked red carpets hand in hand, smiling for the cameras, and often spoke affectionately about each other in interviews. But behind those practiced smiles was a quiet storm. Keith was touring relentlessly. His passion for music, the same thing that made Nicole fall in love with him, had now become the very thing keeping them apart. He'd spend weeks, sometimes months, on the road, performing in city after city, while Nicole stayed behind, managing family life and her own demanding film career. Friends later revealed that the distance began to take an emotional toll. Nicole, who had always cherished deep emotional connection, felt herself growing lonely. She wanted her husband home, not just in her heart, but in her arms, a close friend once said. She missed the simple things, dinners together, laughing with the kids, just being a family. Meanwhile, Keith was trapped in his own internal struggle. Though he had overcome his addiction years before, the pressure of maintaining that sobriety, combined with the weight of fame and expectations, often left him feeling isolated. He once confessed in an interview, "When you've battled addiction, the fight never really ends. You just learn to live differently." Nicole understood that pain, but she also carried her own. Having endured a highly publicized and painful divorce from Tom Cruise years earlier, she had vowed never to lose herself in another relationship. Yet, as Keith's absences grew longer, she began to feel the familiar ache of being alone in love. There were attempts to fix things. Nicole joined Keith on tour whenever possible, bringing the girls along to keep the family together. Keith, in turn, scaled back on certain projects to spend more time at home. For a while, it worked. But old habits and the demands of their careers always found their way back in. Behind closed doors, the couple faced more than just physical distance. They had begun to grow apart emotionally, their conversations becoming shorter, their silences longer. Friends say that while there was no explosive fight, the quiet tension between them became unbearable. Nicole once described Keith as a man full of music, emotion, and mystery. But over time, that mystery began to feel like a wall she couldn't break through. And for Keith, the constant push and pull between love and duty, between being a husband and being a performer, became too heavy to bear. He loved Nicole deeply, but he also knew that she deserved more than a husband who was always chasing the next concert, the next recording, the next audience. In his heart, he began to wonder if staying was helping her or hurting her. "I think love sometimes becomes a mirror," Keith said in a later interview. "You look at the other person and realize you're not giving them what they truly need. That realization breaks you." By 2021, their marriage had quietly reached a breaking point. They were still together in public, but privately, the emotional connection that once held them so tightly had faded into a polite distance. Nicole, ever the professional, continued smiling through interviews. While Keith poured his feelings into his music, the only place he could speak without words. The world didn't see the late-night talks, the tears, or the heartbreaking acceptance that maybe love wasn't enough this time. But they both knew what was coming, a decision neither wanted to make, yet both understood was inevitable, and when it finally came, it wasn't with anger or shouting. It was quiet, heartfelt, a mutual goodbye. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't come in a tabloid headline or a press release. It came from Keith Urban himself, a quiet, emotional confession that left fans in tears. Sitting across from an interviewer in what was meant to be a casual conversation about his new music, Keith suddenly went deeper than anyone expected. He paused for a moment, his eyes distant, before saying softly, "You know, sometimes love isn't about holding on. It's about letting go before you destroy the very thing you cherish." Those words broke the silence around his separation from Nicole Kidman. It was the first time he had publicly hinted that their marriage had ended, and that he was the one who had decided to walk away. Behind that statement was years of reflection, guilt, and heartbreak. Keith explained that despite the love they had, their worlds had become too different. Nicole's life revolved. But as painful as it was, Keith also recognized that clinging to something that no longer brought peace was unfair, not just to Nicole, but to both of them. They had grown into two people on separate paths, connected by love but divided by life. The breakup, according to insiders, wasn't sudden. It was years in the making. They had tried therapy, long breaks, and even extended vacations to rekindle what they once had. But every time, the same problems resurfaced: distance, exhaustion, and unspoken resentment. When the separation finally became official, it was done quietly, with respect and privacy. There were no accusations, no public blame. Just two people who had shared a deep, beautiful chapter, deciding to end it gracefully. In the months that followed, Keith found solace in his music. His lyrics began to shift, more introspective, more vulnerable. Songs that once celebrated love now carried undertones of loss and reflection. In one emotional performance, fans noted tears in his eyes as he sang, "I loved you enough to set you free. Even if that meant losing me," the crowd cheered, unaware that those lines were Keith's way of saying goodbye to the woman who had been the center of his world. Nicole, for her part, remained composed. In a later interview, she spoke fondly of Keith, calling him an incredible man with a heart full of compassion. But she also hinted at the pain beneath the surface, saying, "Sometimes two good people just can't walk the same road anymore." It was a statement filled with grace and sorrow. Keith, meanwhile, retreated into his art. Friends described him as quieter, more contemplative, and often lost in thought. He admitted that the hardest part wasn't losing Nicole, it was realizing how much of himself he had lost trying to keep everything together. He once told a close friend, "She was my calm in a world of noise. I'll always love her, just not in the same way anymore." That confession marked the start of Keith's healing, and the truth fans would finally come to understand. His decision wasn't born of anger or betrayal. It came from love. A love strong enough to recognize when it was time to let go. But even with time, the ache lingered. Every stage he stepped onto, every song he sang carried traces of her, of what they were, and what they could have been. And while Keith Urban never openly confirmed the details of their split, his music told the story the world needed to hear. A man who loved deeply, lost painfully, and learned that sometimes, even the truest love has an ending. After the dust settled and the headlines faded, Keith Urban did something that surprised everyone. He disappeared from the spotlight. No interviews, no tours, no red carpets. For months, he retreated from public life, seeking solace far away from the noise of fame and heartbreak. Friends say he went back to Australia for a while, visiting the countryside where he grew up. It was there, surrounded by open skies and quiet roads, that Keith began the long, painful process of healing. For years, he had been running from addiction, from loneliness, and finally, from the pain of losing the woman he thought he'd grow old with. Now there was nowhere to run. All he had left was himself, and for the first time in decades, that had to be enough. He spent mornings walking barefoot through the grass, guitar in hand, writing melodies that reflected both grief and gratitude. Locals occasionally spotted him in small cafes, sitting alone, scribbling lyrics on napkins. Those close to him said he looked lighter, not happy, but free. One close friend revealed he wasn't the same Keith we all knew. He wasn't chasing perfection anymore. He was just trying to find peace, and slowly he did. Music had always been his therapy, and in solitude, he rediscovered why he fell in love with it in the first place. It wasn't about fame or charts. It was about expression, turning pain into poetry, heartbreak into healing. When Keith eventually returned to the studio, his team noticed the change immediately. His songs weren't about the bright lights or the wild energy of love anymore. They were reflective, emotional, and deeply honest. Tracks like Letting Go to Love Again and The Quiet Between Us spoke directly to what he had endured. A man learning to rebuild from the ashes of a love he couldn't save. During a later interview, Keith said something that stuck with fans worldwide. "I lost a part of myself when I lost her, but I also found a part of me I'd never met before. The one that didn't need to be perfect to be loved." That honesty became the foundation of his comeback. His performances carried more emotion than ever, his voice trembling not from nerves, but from truth. Crowds who once cheered for his energy now fell, silent in awe of his vulnerability. But perhaps the biggest surprise came when Keith began reconnecting with the people who had been waiting for him, his daughters. The time away from Hollywood allowed him to rebuild those bonds without distraction. He described those moments as the truest joy I've ever known. Fans who met him at meet and greets noticed a different man. No longer the charming rock star with a perfectly rehearsed smile, but a grounded, gentle soul who had learned to embrace imperfection. As the years passed, Keith didn't shy away from speaking about the pain, but he also didn't let it define him. When asked about Nicole during a charity event, he smiled softly and said, "We shared something beautiful, and that's enough." Those words silenced every rumor, every headline, every assumption. There was no bitterness, just closure. Today, Keith Urban's life is quieter. He still tours, still writes, and still pours his heart into every lyric. But there's a calmness to him now, a peace that only comes when you've faced your deepest heartbreak and survived it. He often says that music saved him, but this time, it wasn't the stage that healed him. It was the stillness. In one recent performance, before playing his emotional ballad, What Remains, he looked out at the crowd and said softly, "Sometimes love doesn't end. It just changes shape. And if you listen closely, it never really leaves you." The audience rose to their feet, many in tears. Realizing they weren't just hearing a song, they were witnessing a man who had finally made peace with his past. Keith Urban's story isn't just one of fame and heartbreak. It's about transformation, a reminder that even when love fades, life has a way of beginning again. And as the final chords rang out, Keith smiled, not as a broken man remembering what he lost, but as someone grateful for what the pain had taught him, that sometimes the hardest goodbye can lead you right back to yourself.